lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience. My name is Rose Cartwright. I'm going to start by just telling you very briefly a little bit about me. Okay, we have the slides, good. So I'm an author and a screenwriter. As Hattie said, I'm a co-writer and co-producer on the Netflix sci-fi series Three Body Problem. Nice. I also wrote a memoir called Pure about intrusive sexual thoughts and OCD that came out in 2015. That memoir was adapted for Channel 4. The show came out in 2019. Much of the content of my talk today is about my new book, The Maps We Carry. In part, the book is a healing memoir of how underground therapy with MDMA, mushrooms, hippie flips, and ayahuasca radically transformed my mental health. It's in part an examination of the psychedelic renaissance through the lens of critical psychiatry and class. And I just want to set the tone of my talk today with a very brief reading from The Maps We Carry. It's actually the opening chapter, and it's called Intentions. This morning we sat in a circle, took a deep breath, and set our intentions. Some intended to heal, others to surrender. There were tears and respectful silences and nods of understanding. Now we take the magic mushrooms and everything goes dark. For the next 2 hours, I watch my identity slide like guts. There is nothing with any recognizable form, only an endless churn of textures that I cannot identify. Nothing, including me, has ever existed, only a single emotion, primal fear. Later, I push through into a vast space of light, where love has a physical, glowing materiality that I can touch, and of which every cell in my body is made. Orchestral music builds as my heart is broken wide open, and I weep tears of love for the people around me. One of them has regressed to infancy and rocks back and forth. Another holds their head. Another sways softly, whispering to themselves. Another sheds ecstatic tears. I take in the scene, and I have a thought. What a bunch of assholes. I burst out laughing and turn away. Someone is groaning like a child. Someone else sighs in bliss, unselfconsciously loud. When are these assholes going to shut up, I say, pressing my face into the pillow, unearthing all of the laughter that's been fossilizing at the back of silent classrooms and solemn churches and po-faced yoga studios where I buried it in layers over years, along with many other miscellaneous thoughts and feelings. I cover my mouth and laugh through my fingers as someone to my left battles an inner demon. His wailing is genuinely irritating, insufferably irritating, and I find myself wishing that he would re-repress some of that generational pain so that I can get a moment's peace. Trying to stop the laughter only makes it worse. What this means to me, the hypocrisy and sheer unreasonableness of slinging fatuous insults at friends during their most unguarded and transcendent moments, is unfolding with a rush of revelatory energy. I see into the mechanics of the laughter and understand what I'm supposed to understand. That I can only find this funny because the love between me and these people is unquestioned, and that is from this biting point of mutually informing reverence and irreverence that I know I must try to write this book. It's something I had been puzzling over. How do I criticize our mental health system with a scathingness that feels necessary, while also respecting the people working within it? How do I challenge psychiatry's framing of serious distress as disease, while honoring what that framing means to people? How do I appraise the ways in which my own ignorance has perpetuated unhelpful stories about mental health, while also showing myself compassion? How do I construct as much as I deconstruct, offer hope as much as I call bullshit? I can only do this if there's a mutual understanding between us from the start that my critique comes from a place of love, and that it is my intention to write from that place. Okay, I'm just going to try and move this forward a little second, so I'm not arching over. How's that? Is that okay? Wait. Okay, now I can't see the screen. That's helpful. All right, take a drink. So, the title of my talk today is A House Built on Sand. How can the psychedelic renaissance avoid repeating psychiatry's historic mistakes? Those inherited mistakes, as I see them, include the medicalization of reactive stress, the wholesale adoption of the American psychiatric diagnostic system, patient healer power asymmetry, and the conceptualization and treatment of distress as an individual rather than communal problem. The psychedelic renaissance bills itself as progressive, but in my opinion, it still broadly fails to move the dial on the systemic problems that are making people unhappy in the first place. So why am I here? Why am I speaking about this stuff? Well, I have the dubious privilege of having spent 2 decades immersing myself in a wide variety of mainstream psych treatments, including most of the major psychotherapies, many alternative therapies, and antidepressants. I think patient testimony and non-clinical perspectives are too often subjugated to the authority of mental health professionals. I beat the drum for the idea that people with mental health problems know much more about their inner lives than any professional around them could possibly know, that they are experts on themselves, and that psych professionals need to defer to and facilitate that expertise. As a screenwriter, I have to be a generalist. I have to know a little bit about a lot of things in order to step into many characters' perspectives and weave them together into a whole. I have to stay zoomed out in order to see the broader story and web of relationships that fabricate it. I grew up on benefits in the West Midlands. Many times I went to the dole office with my dad. Many times I visited Mum when she was repeatedly hospitalised in a poorly funded, secure psychiatric unit in a deprived area of Dudley. Worlds away, I now work in Hollywood, among the most materially privileged and deranged people on the planet. All of this is to say that having a foot in different worlds, having different lenses to screw on, and very much standing at a distance from this industry has been helpful when analysing the systems and relationships within something as huge as mental health and psychedelic culture. Specialisms and expertise are vital, but they can also become something of a problem. I've found that mental health professionals tend to believe that their particular therapy, medicine, or research area, the thing they've spent money and time training in, the thing for which they earn prestige, is what works best. And generally, they will be on board with the critique of the system until that critique is brought against their specialism. As we shall see, these incentives are part of what, in my opinion, makes Western mental health care so abysmal and resistant to change. The theme of our session today is from clinic to community, which is actually an excellent, succinct summary of the shift in my philosophy. While I do think that psychiatric research and treatment will be an essential component in tackling our mental health crisis, and I wholeheartedly support investment in biomedical approaches, I believe our mental health crisis is far more a cultural, social, and political problem than it is a medical one. Like so many of us, I've come to the conclusion that there is little evidence that our mental health crisis is an epidemic of discrete, organic brain disorders. Of course, mental health is multifactorial. Of course, genetics and biology are important levels of analysis, especially in more serious mental health conditions. But generally, I think that overemphasis on the biological etiology of suffering and on the clinical interventions at the expense of the psycho, social, and the spiritual has been disastrous. We are facing a crisis of lost meaning, lost community, and lost livelihoods. And I think the solution lies more in the restoration of those things than in the search for novel treatments. One of the writers who has most moved and galvanized me is Malidoma Somé. In a beautiful book called Of Water and the Spirit, he wrote vividly about tribal initiation in Burkina Faso. Malidoma Somé said, "The modern world is on a long, hard trip into the future in search of the values of the past." And I'm going to say it again because I really like this. The modern world is on a long, hard trip into the future in search of the values of the past. And I think it's on this long, hard trip where we find so much research into mental health faltering, caught in an absurd, topsy-turvy attempt to justify with science what we already know in our bones, as traditional knowledge is subjugated to scientific authority. Every week, studies are published proving that things like nature, singing, dance, exercise, and community make us happier, framing these things as prescriptions for ills, rather than the cornerstone characteristics of healthy lifestyles that prevent those ills. Many of the brilliant psychiatrists and researchers I've spoken to have said something similar. They feel they're using science as a Trojan horse to sneak common sense past the gatekeepers. It strikes me that so many of you are frustrated at having to toe the medicalized line of conservative, psychiatric and neuroscientific establishments, and you feel you can't push back, since so much of the industry depends essentially on the overcomplication and obfuscation of the causes of distress. Psychiatrist Professor Alan Francis, who we'll talk about later, one of the key authors of the DSM, which I'll talk a lot about later, said this: "It doesn't require rocket science or new research. We have known for 50 years how to provide care for severe mental illness. There is nothing mysterious or complicated about it. Decent housing, easily accessible treatment, social clubs, vocational rehab, positive regard, respect, empathy, family support." I write a great deal about community and the maps we carry. I believe it was the relationality that psychedelics made possible that really healed me, rather than the trips themselves. The last chapter of my book is called "I Am Because I Party," a phrase I borrow from psychologist James Hillman, who I greatly admire. He wrote this fantastic passage: "If the self were defined as the interiorization of community, then the boundaries between me and another would be much less sure. I would be with myself when I'm walking with others. I would not be with myself when I'm walking alone. And others would not only include other people. Community, as I see it, is something more ecological, or at least animistic, a psychic field. And if I'm not in a psychic field with others, with people, buildings, animals, trees, I am not. So it wouldn't be, I am because I think, as Descartes said, it would be, I am because I party." Hillman, by the way, had a very, very, very skeptical take on the whole psychotherapeutic project. He wrote a great book called "We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Still Getting Worse," which I highly recommend. But his skepticism comes from a place of idealism, and I really identify with that because I hope mine is too. In this presentation, I'm critiquing the medical model and the most reductive versions of the trauma model too, but I do believe that these models should remain on the table for those that find them helpful, as long as they're signposted as models, i.e. as maps of reality, not reality itself, and therefore intrinsically limited. A map of the coastline will be accurate in one sense, but it won't tell you anything about the essence of the beach, how the seaweed smells, the chalky sound of the pebbles underfoot. Even if a story is reductive, I believe we have to deconstruct it with care. The novelist John Berger said, "When I think of somebody telling a story, I see a group of people huddled together, and around them a vast space, quite frightening. In the very idea of story, there is something to do with shelter, this almost physical sense of shelter, where the story represents a kind of habitation, a kind of home." As part of my research, I wanted to learn more about communal rights in a traditional society. I went to Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, where I visited a school for animist priestesses. I witnessed the initiation ceremony of a young priestess into a sacred order of elder women. At the broadest level, what struck me visually about the hours-long ceremony is the way that elder women were so often circling the young initiate. By dancing all around her, they were ensuring that her body was housed and held by a larger social body. In modern Western culture, because we've lost so many of those encircling communal structures that hold us in orbit and stop us spinning away, we replace those structures with stories, and we hold on to them tight because we're insecure. So, as psychedelics continue to be popularized in the West, how do we demolish the stories that no longer serve us and build new ones that are fit for purpose? When I was 15 years old, horrifying intrusive thoughts about sex, violence, and abuse started bombarding my mind, and they didn't stop for the next 15 years. That's not an exaggeration. By the age of 18, I was bulimic and self-harming. By 21, I was suicidal. Over the years, the themes of my obsessions changed to include intrusive abusive language, fears about the structural integrity of buildings, excessive doubts about my sexuality, intrusive mental images of my bones breaking as I walked, and a conviction that my face and body were physically monstrous. Utmost hypervigilance was essential in this world of cosmic fear, where every impulse could be acted upon, every ceiling could crash, every thought could be true. Having kept my shameful thoughts secret for over a decade, I told my family about them, and a lot of other people at the same time, with this Guardian article that came out in 2013. The title was not written by me. This was the first time that the theme of taboo OCD thoughts had ever been written about in the press, and it blew up in quite a massive way. Soon I turned the article into the book Pure, and then came the TV show. Society had told me a very specific story about my suffering. It said I had a mental illness, an illness like any other, that anyone could develop, and that could be treated as physical disease. It said that my thoughts were the symptoms of this illness, an illness that was decontextualized from my life. As part of my new OCD poster girl status, I parroted that story ad nauseum. Mental illness can happen to any of us, I wrote in Vice magazine in 2014, like a cold or a cancer. I had assumed that my diagnosis meant that the doctor had correctly identified the specific problem with my brain that I shared with everyone else with the same diagnosis. I first had that worldview challenge in 2017, when I went to the neuroscience lab at Trinity College Dublin, and a professor there called Claire Gillen explained to me that psychiatric diagnoses are constructs rather than biological realities, that they are woolly, overlapping, and heterogeneous, that they are subjective descriptions of a problem, not objective explanations. I was really upset when I heard this. I had quite a visceral reaction. It felt like an attack on my identity. So much of my identity had got caught up with this idea that I had OCD and that OCD was a concrete biological thing. I was also confused. Why had no doctor ever explained to me the difference? Why had I been led to understand that my diagnosis identified a specific brain disorder and that this was the root cause of my suffering? I was troubled that there seemed to be such a vast gap in knowledge between what clinicians and researchers know and what the public knows. When a powerful group has access to knowledge that another group does not, it can be called an epistemic injustice. That's a phrase from British philosopher Miranda Fricker. To me, there was an epistemic injustice here. It was an injustice that the public generally wasn't aware that the decades-long billion-dollar hunt for biomarkers to support psychiatric diagnostic categories as laid out in the DSM had been largely fruitless. Why were we the last to know? In 2023, I went to the Wellcome Library in London to read the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the Bible. This is the manual that guided the doctors who told my mother she had bipolar disorder, my brother that he had ADHD, and led all three of us to being prescribed what we assumed were targeted medications for what we assumed were discrete conditions. Meanwhile, the social issues that were upstream of our shared distress were completely ignored. More on that later. I devote a whole chapter of the book to how mind-blowingly absurd the DSM is, but for now, I just want to share with you a glimpse of how it was created in a series of meetings in New York. During these meetings, a team of up to 15 psychiatrists would get together to decide what diagnosis would be and would not be included. How did they decide? Not with biological evidence from brain scans or blood tests and so on, since no evidence existed, but by arguing amongst themselves about what was and wasn't a disorder. One of the psychiatrists present, Alan Francis again, gave this account. There was a lot of screaming and yelling about this criteria, that criteria, this diagnosis should be in, that diagnosis should be out. Then everyone would vote on the final decision. Psychiatrists would come with their pet diagnoses, heavily biased by desire for prestige and financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. Those who were the most senior and the loudest tended to be the ones who got their diagnoses included. In the mornings of these day-long meetings, everyone would turn up raring to go. The arguments would be heated. Then, and this is my favorite bit, they would order a big pastrami deli lunch, lots of pickles, and everyone would get really tired. So as a result, the afternoon's discussions were much less animated because in their after-lunch lethargy, the psychiatrists were less motivated to scrutinize or argue. This means that the diagnoses that went on to influence the treatment of millions of people were potentially conceived in a food coma. The product of an unserious, unscientific, cavalier, and financially incentivized process. Does this sound like the kind of framework on which we should build psychedelic research? Diagnosis enables specific treatments to be marketed to specific individuals. And I already see the same happening in the psychedelic space. It's not that some broad categorization isn't useful. Indeed, as Professor Alan Horowitz said in his history of the DSM, in the 1950s and 60s, a basic distinction between neurosis and psychosis was sufficient for prescribing purposes. And of course, that basic distinction remains an important one in the psychedelic space, one that undoubtedly keeps people safe. But I think many lay people would be really shocked to discover how little specificity truly exists in psychiatry. This epistemic injustice has real-world consequences. When information is gatekept, it leads to lack of informed consent. My mom still takes the 4 psychiatric medications she was prescribed 2 decades ago, though they've had a net negative impact on her health because she's too frightened to come off them. Meanwhile, over the years, our family received none of the support that would have tackled the problem from the ground up and made her life easier: help with childcare, fairly paid work, access to physical space that facilitates our most powerful conduit to resilience, community. Mom needed circles of people, circles of generations surrounding her every day, keeping her in orbit, and we had none of that. And still, she was told she was treatment resistant, placing the onus on her for her resistance. And my question is, how would psychedelic therapy have actually solved any of these problems? I take all of this very seriously, and I've been generally heartened to discover that so many psychedelics researchers do too. I interviewed researcher Dr. Sarah Tai, and she said, "I feel very pigeonholed. Unless I do psychedelics research that continues to support diagnostic assumptions, I can't get funding. If I don't measure symptoms as the main outcome of a trial, I'm not allowed to do the trial." Many of you will know about Robin Carhart-Harris's canalization model, which I think is actually a very helpful general model of mental health. I interviewed Robin on BBC Radio 4 about some of this last year. According to the canalization theory, people become ever more deeply entrenched into grooves or canals of thinking, an entrenchment that seems to correlate to rigid, limited, and repetitive activity in the brain. I find it risible that rigidity and inflexibility are the hallmark problems of a mental health system that claims to help people overcome rigidity and inflexibility. And this is what I mean when I say a house built on sand. None of what I'm saying is original or new, but I think this truism bears repeating. To an outsider like me, the mental health system and many parts of the psychedelic system seem as mad as anyone they're trying to treat. Through my work with MDMA, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and hippie flipping, I went from being self-harming and suicidal to being stable, happy, and whole. Anthropologist Gregory Bateson called altered states of consciousness poetic consciousness, as opposed to normal waking prosaic consciousness. And as a writer, I really fell in love with that framing. How and why did poetic consciousness heal me? Well, I really don't know the answer to that. That's a mystery to me. Perhaps because the trips helped me unpick the stress of my childhood. I came to understand that my intrusive thoughts were not symptoms of illness or signs that there was anything wrong with my brain. They were strategies to protect me from total psychological disintegration. They were my psyche's best attempt to make sense of unbearable physical sensations at a time when the truth about my caregiver's desperation was not graspable to a child's mind or safe to know. That said, throughout my psychedelic work, I've always tried to resist simple conclusions about cause and effect. The phrase I use most in the book is "hold it lightly," and I try to talk about ways of seeing rather than explanations. Ways of seeing is a phrase I borrowed from Buddhist scholar Rob Babaya. When meditating, you're constantly encouraged to see through rather than reify the solidity of your stories, and I think this movement needs more of that. I remember when I was a kid, my mom told her doctor that talk therapy wasn't helping her feel better, and he suggested that maybe the problem was her attitude. What Mom was describing was the finger trap dynamic in mental health care. The more you struggle, the deeper in you get. The more you oppose, the more this is evidence of your dysfunction. In the history of psychiatry, the subjectivities of one powerful group got exported and labeled as objective truth, while the subjectivities of others got labeled disordered. Asymmetric authority between mental health professionals and patients risks recreating the conditions of powerlessness that traumatize us in the first place. I've seen it time and time again. Professionals running their patients through their own narrow model to the exclusion of other ways of seeing. Just like the medical model, the trauma model can give professionals the illusion of understanding the person in front of them. I've encountered leader-follower dynamics in the psychedelic space too, guides working in a very heavy-handed way with credulity, handing people frameworks rather than facilitating open inquiry, and professionalizing knowledge that should be open-sourced. Ego is not the problem. It's what you do with it. I have an ego. That's why I write books about myself, and I seek out galactic-scale sci-fi metaphors on which to project my inner life. My concern with the minority of psychedelics guides is that their canvas is vulnerable people. They're enrolling vulnerable people in their healer fantasies, and that's the same old shit I've seen from psychiatry for decades. What I'm calling for is not the replacement of one reductive framework with another, but a certain kind of humility in the face of the mystery of mental health and psychedelics, a scrutinizing of the water we're swimming in, a refusal to pass off subjective constructs as objective reality, the boldness to question the psych industry's status quo, and the keeping of many models on the table so that they can check and balance each other. And I'm just going to end with a brief reading from the Maps We Carry. It's actually the final paragraph. So much in our mental health conversation encourages us to analyze what's happened to us or what's wrong with us, to reduce ourselves to our upbringing or our brain chemistry. When we hit on something that rings true, we can become certain that we finally understand ourselves and insist that others adopt that same understanding. Our credulity can then limit our openness to new perspectives. Drip by drip, we form stories upon existing stories until they solidify into stalagmites and keep us trapped in the cave, blocked off from the reality of who we really are. If you trust yourself enough and the universe enough, if you love yourself enough and you are loved enough, you can map your way out to a world of possibilities, not by clinging to any one of your old stories, but by relaxing your grip and moving into the space and light between them. Thank you.